So what we can do, though, is we can look at all of the things that need to be explained in and surrounding the resurrection of Jesus and then ask, what's the best explanation? Why do we see things the way that they are? So that's what we mean when we're doing textual criticism and looking for textual evidence. We want to have many objective, reliable, sufficient early eyewitness accounts. And we talked about this on Sunday, that when it comes to the New Testament, with its 5,700 manuscript copies that are extant, along with the most generous wealth of information in terms of another 24,000 copies in other languages, in a lifetime of the witnesses, which predates any other book of all of antiquity. So when it comes to how many copies we have, the veracity of them to the 99.5th percentile, to the different languages that all tell the exact same story, to the number of eyewitnesses, both secular, hostile, and friendly to the events that took place, as well as the church tradition of the early church fathers who replicate the entire New Testament outside of 11 verses with just their correspondence. We can say with really great confidence that the book that we're holding is the same that was originally written, and that the names, dates, times, and events that took place were accurate as recorded history. And if you come to the conclusion that it's an insufficient body of evidence, which is a reasonable thing to conclude, but you must also then, on those grounds, get rid of everything in antiquity. So that's Thales, that's Socrates, that's Plato, that's Herodotus, that's the histories, that's the apologies, that's everything we know about the Gallic Wars and the empires of the Greco-Roman, where it's just all gone. Because the manuscript evidence and the time gaps between the Bible and compared to these other documents that tell us what we know about most of classical antiquity, the Bible is so much more robust that to throw that out, you got to get rid of everything else if you want to be consistent in your reasoning. So tonight we're going to look at some of the more specific things. We talked about the Morse-Hap test, says that the Bible is many objective, reliable, sufficiently early eyewitness accounts that have been verified by history, archaeology, and prophecy. So the Hap part of it, H-A-P, is kind of the area that we're going to dive into headlong tonight. When we look at history, we might say that there's continuity inside of the book itself, but it has to correspond to the events that were happening elsewhere. So we talked about how even secular writers and hostile writers were writing about Jesus, but we want to look at when you dig in the dirt, when you do an archaeological dig in the ancient Near East, as opposed to other belief systems or other religious books that really have no bearing in the dirt or have no veracity in the areas where the events took place. Do we have anything, are we afforded anything from the Bible itself? The Smithsonian Institute, when you ask it, which we talked about last week, about the validity of the Book of Mormon, they write it off as complete farce. They say the names, dates, times, places, the animals that they claim to have had, the food they claim to have eaten, the wars they claim to have taken place, the battles that they claim to have fought in, none of it holds weight. Likewise, if you ask the Smithsonian about the Bible, it will tell you that historically speaking, the Smithsonian uses the Bible as a guide to know where to dig, what to expect, and the actual cultures of Asia Minor at the time. So the Smithsonian is disregarding a religious text and using another one as their reason behind where they dig, why they dig, and what they expect those empires to have been like. So it's not all the same. There is a differentiation, and so I think the credence of asking the question, has God spoken, should lie with a book that is able to do things you wouldn't expect a book to do. Now, I want you to go back and think with me on this idea for a second, which is if you're God, which you're not, but imagine you are, and you know that there is going to be generation after generation after generation that is going to be telling this story of what took place. You are left with very few options on what you could potentially do in order to show people that the document that they're reading has divine inspiration. It was divinely formulated. It was sovereignly given. It was architected in such a way that it would hold the test of time. You have very few options. What would you do if you were trying to write a book today so that people thousands of years from now would believe that the events that took place, which might seem crazy to them, actually happened? There'd be a few things I think you'd lean into. Number one is that you would have knowledge. The omniscient God of the universe would have knowledge that goes beyond what people could know. Secondly, the things that you were able to put in the ground to have uncovered later on, you would want those to be specific. Likewise, the historical, kind of the ripple effect of what took place, you would want to have enough power behind it that the generations would continue to speak about it. That third part, I think, is prima facie. You and I are sitting here today in the year 2024, which is the year 2024 AD, Anno Domini, which is literally means 2024 years ago, Jesus Christ died on the cross. Like it's our whole calendar system. Whatever you think happened 2024 years ago, it was weird enough that we decided to start counting from then. It was strange enough, it was bizarre enough, it was upsetting enough that a culture of Jews who held to the scriptures as being this divinely inspired book and rejected Christianity under the persecution of Diocletian and Domitian and Nero, who are trying to exterminate it, we're still sitting here. So that can be a lot of different things, a lot of different reasons. The problem is that you're talking about a character named Jesus who was a poor peasant carpenter who lived for 30 years doing absolutely nothing except for tecton work. He was a quarry worker or he was a stone worker. Then he decided to do 3 years worth of ministry where he called 12 people, most of whom were illiterate. He never went more than 30 to 40 miles outside of his hometown. He never wrote a book himself. He didn't have a podcast. Can you believe that? There's so many, and there's something about this small peasant, insignificant, the book of Isaiah calls him an ugly, of no stature guy. Something happened that we're talking about him today. And whether or not you believe that the resurrection is the pinnacle turning point of all of history or not, you still have to give a reason why a group of highly intelligent, religiously based, anti-Christian people like the Jews who governed the whole area underneath the vassal state of Rome, who wanted nothing about insurrection and want to continue to use people in the way that they did. You talk about, if you go read about like Roman culture and pederasty and the abuse of slaves and the sexualization and objectification of women, the Jesus movement doesn't really make a lot of sense. That this peasant carpenter who, again, had no kind of stature or anything, that Isaiah 53 would behold us to him, his small, insignificant 3 years of ministry where he didn't travel very far, it has forever changed our calendar system. And the Jews, the whole history of the Jews, there's an Old Testament rabbi, they call him Rambam. I guess he couldn't get him to stop, but he's got a much longer Hebrew name, but he was affectionately known as Rambam. He says, he laid out 13 tenets of all of Judaism, and one of the 13 tenets of all of Judaism is that we await the Messiah every single day. So for thousands of years, the whole story of the Old Testament is one in nature. When's Messiah getting here? When's Messiah getting here? When is Messiah getting here? This actually comes back from the proto-evangelion in Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, that the mankind falls in the garden, and then there's a promise made that God speaks to the woman and to the serpent and says, I am going to send one that will crush your head while you strike his heel. In other words, the fixing of the brokenness of the sinful condition will be that a seed of the woman, not of the man, which is interesting in a patriarchal culture. Why does it speak of the woman specifically? Because sin was passed down through the man, and Jesus was born of a virgin named Mary, which is it's not normal in their culture to have done something like that. But the prediction that God makes is that through this lineage, there will become a war between the descendants of the serpent and the descendant of the woman. And the descendant of the woman will crush the head of the snake. But in the same way that you would try to step on like a rattlesnake, the rattlesnake is going to turn his head upwards. And while the man crushes the head of the serpent will grab the heel of the man and will poison the man, and the man will die a cursed death. But in dying the cursed death, he will actually exterminate the power of the serpent. This is the very first gospel message, all the way back in Genesis chapter 3. Then you follow the lineage of this man throughout time, and this people group throughout time, from Abraham to Israel to Isaac to Jacob to all of these different tribes of Judah, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun, ultimately to the person and work of Jesus Christ, whose death, burial, and resurrection is the center point of all of human history. They're waiting for this Messiah. It was also important in God's deep love for the Jews that Jesus be so specifically prophesied about that when he showed up, no one would miss him. So we're going to dive into some of these things right now, but this is the reason why we would expect a book like this to have such power. We would expect it to have such power. It's not because God is trying to hide himself. When you dive into it, God is trying to make himself very clear. So this is the evidence behind why we believe that the Bible has strong evidence historically, archaeologically, and prophetically. I am going to, if I had to guess, I'll be touching on about 0.5% of all of the evidence. Maybe less than that. So when it comes like Christological prophecies, there's 465 Old Testament Christological prophecies that talk exactly about what Jesus is going to do, where he's going to be from, what he's going to accomplish, what he's going to be like, where he'll be born, where he's going to die, how he's going to die. 460. That means if you studied a passage of prophecy about Jesus every day for a year, you would need 100 more days. That's the robustness of how much the Old Testament talks about. Why? Because God wants people to not miss Jesus. Then, on top of that, there are hundreds, probably to the tune of about 1,980 other prophecies where people make predictions of future events, and all of them have come true. The section of those that have not come true are all speaking about what's going to happen when Jesus returns at the end of time to call us back to himself. So there's actually a pocket of prophecies that remain open because we're expectant of Christ's return someday. So what is the evidence? What exactly are we talking about? The first is to recognize that all of history, when it comes to this conversation, begins with kind of a skeptical view of the text, okay? What you're going to run into when you start studying biblical archaeology, biblical prophecy, is that the people who study it don't begin, just as we talked about Albright and Bruce and those other people this weekend, they don't begin with a mind favorable to the text. This is one thing that I found very frustrating in going to Israel, is you could have 99 things out of 100 in this passage, right? We talked about Luke chapter 2. In those days, Caesar Augustus issues a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. This is the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor over Syria. Everyone went to his own. These are all verifiable facts that you can look in history and find. And then somewhere in that long line of names, dates, times, and places, it will say, in the town of Nazareth, in Galilee, to Judea, to Bethlehem, the city of David. And then they'll go, did you say city of David? We've never heard Bethlehem called the city of David before. Therefore, the whole Bible is false. And the more that you run into this, the more that you realize archaeology and textual critics and historical and historians won't give you an inch when it comes to the Bible. You will have to prove everything that you want. So no one's digging in the dirt assuming you're going to find, and when you're digging in teams of skeptics and people who, they're all kind of working hand in hand. So when we talk about these things that have veracity in history or veracity in archaeology, it's not like they find a coin and they go, this was the coin that Jesus put in the slot machine in order to win the lottery in the year. That's not the case. You don't find one thing and then have inductive reasoning on what it could be. You've got to earn your stripes with all of this stuff. I'll give you an example. There was the character of Belshazzar. Historians insisted that Belshazzar was a person who never even existed. The Old Testament talks about Belshazzar in the Babylonian lineage. The Bible was the only known document to mention him. Every historian knew that King Nabonidus was the final king of Babylon. But the Bible said that's not the case. This man named Belshazzar is actually the last king. So there was this argument. And you know how long the skeptical community said, therefore the whole Bible is false? Yes, we found Jericho, we found Tyre, we found all these. There's 23,000 archaeological digs that have been done. We know that all of them to this point have proven the Bible. But look, Belshazzar didn't exist. Therefore, we write out the whole thing. Well, then, in 1854, John Taylor's British archaeologist is excavating an ancient temple in Babylonian Ur, where Abraham is from, in Iraq. He discovered what became known as the Nabonidus cylinders. And it says this, as for Belshazzar, the eldest son, the offspring of my heart, let not sin possess him. Let him be satisfied with fullness of life. So Nabonidus is saying that he actually has a son named Belshazzar, the very thing that we were arguing the whole time from Scripture. And then all of historical society just moved on, went, oh, okay. But there wasn't like a, holy cow, it's just, oh, okay, you got us on that one. And then it can get frustrating. Or this one, this group called the Hittites. Scripture describes Abraham burying his wife in the land bought from a Hittite merchant. The Hittites were allied with the kings of Israel in fending off the Syrian Empire. Yet, like Belshazzar, the empire's existence was claimed only by the Bible prior to the 20th century. Historians said it probably never existed, and even if it did, it couldn't have been very strong regional power considering this lack of evidence. Until in 1906, an immense, sprawling, fortified city found in modern-day Turkey was confirmed to have been the Hittite capital, Hattusha. A Hittite royal library of around 10,000 tablets helped prove to archaeologists that these people were indeed the Hittites of the Bible. So there's one way to do all of this, which is to start and say, look, we don't have this, therefore it's false. The other way is, this thing has been proven true thousands and thousands of times. There might be things we haven't dug up yet, but let's begin in a position of beginning to trust these documents. Okay, I'll give you a few of these things as we continue to go. King David, right? I just said, because he belonged to the house and the line of David, he read to the register with Mary, to whom he was pledged to be married to, and they were expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born. She gave birth to her firstborn, a son. She wrapped him in swaddling clothes, placed him in a manger, because there's no room for him in the inn, okay? That's David. Everything else in Luke 2 is identifiable, verifiable, and accredited in history. And then they said, well, people have long said that King David never existed. We don't have any archaeological remains of King David until 30 years ago, the extra biblical evidence comes into play. In 1993, a large stone or stele was discovered during excavations in the ancient northern Israel city of Tel Dan. I've been here. I've seen it, right? This is called the Dan Stele, or the Dan Stela. The victory stone, written in Aramaic, dated to the 9th century BCE, at least 100 years after David would have reigned. This is it. This is the Tel Dan stele, or the stele. And I killed 2 powerful kings who harnessed 2,000 chariots and 2,000 horsemen. I killed Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Akaz, Yahu, son, these are fun names, of the house of David. And he talks about his total, complete annihilation of all of Israel. So he talks about, we just crushed all of them. But he's using ancient Near Eastern war language, which is how you would talk about people, right? There's another one, the Merneptah stele, or when it talks about destroying Israel, it says, we destroyed them totally, every man, woman, and child. We totally and utterly destroyed all of them. So he's using exaggerated ancient Near Eastern war language, just like they would have at the time. And he talks about the house of David. You can go visit that today in Dan, which I'm sure you guys are excited to go to that. This is called the Simon of Cyrene ossuary. This is what's written in the book of Mark. A certain man from Cyrene, Simon, the father of Alexander and Rufus, was passing by on his way in from the country, and they forced him to carry the cross. So, if you're a fan of the New Testament, namely the Gospels where Jesus' death is recorded, Jesus was so weak after being flogged and spit on and beaten and had a crown of thorns pressed on his head that he couldn't carry his own cross up to his own crucifixion. So a man named Simon of Cyrene was asked to carry the cross for him. Great. This is basically an unmentionable person in Scripture. It would have done Mark no harm to go, and then a dude helped Jesus carry his cross. But Mark, again, this is what if you were writing a hoax, this is what you would do. And then a dude helped him carry a cross somewhere. And he was crucified privately behind closed doors. You wouldn't name things like this. But he goes so far as to say, Simon of Cyrene, who has 2 sons named Alexander and Rufus, was asked to carry it. And it seems so goofy that you would write that in there until, perhaps providentially, we find an ossuary, which is a bone box in 1941. There was this cave, and it was basically an ancient burial site. And as you rolled away the stone and went inside of it, you found ossuary. So an ossuary was, when you died, they put you on a slab, and they not really mummified you, but they wrapped you in like burial clothes. And then after a year, they would come in and all of your flesh would have decayed. And then they take your bones and they put your bones in a bone box that was as long as your femur, right? It's your biggest bone. And then they would put put all your bones in this thing, and they would put it on a shelf. You're buried with all your ancestors. So we have ossuaries everywhere in the ancient Near East. That's where they buried people in. And on this one, we found an inscription that says, "This is the bone box of Alexander, son of Simon the Cyrenian." And next to it was Sarah, his daughter of Simon of Ptolemais, which is one of the 5 cities inside of Cyrene. So the evidence just keeps coming in favor of the story itself. This is kind of fun. It's fun. It might ruin the New Testament for you, but it is what it is. So this is called the trumpeting stone. We were kind of digging, when I say we, they were digging around and in the old temple ruins, and they found this little stone that would have gone at one of the corners of the temple where someone would have gone up when Sabbath started, which is sundown on Friday, and would have blown a trumpet to signal to everyone it's time to stop working. Sabbath has begun. So Josephus writes about this. He says that the priest would blow a trumpet or an elector to signal the beginning of Sabbath. Right on the inscription it says, "Belonging to the place or the house of trumpeting." The thing is what makes this so interesting is we recognize now that the word that they're using here for trumpeting is the same word elector that is translated in the Greek New Testament to mean rooster. So the story goes that when you're translating it with some of this information missing in our codis, in our understanding, that when Jesus predicts that Peter's going to deny him 3 times, he uses the word elector. The word elector that was common for them to understand was rooster, but elector here also means trumpet. So it's very reasonable that what Jesus is predicting when he says Peter's going to deny me before the elector crows or the elector calls, is he's saying before the sundown on Sabbath, when the trumpeter gets up and says, "Time to start Sabbath," that's when you will be denying me. Because other than that, rooster's it's a very strange delegation, admittedly, especially because as the type of bird they weren't allowed inside the city gates of Jerusalem. So you could have still heard it from outside the city gates, but this actually makes a lot more sense. So this kind of goes in line with what we're talking about. Jesus answered, "I tell you, Peter, before the rooster crows or the elector sounds today, you will deny me 3 times that you even know me." This one's fun. This is called the Alexamenos graffito. So it kind of reminds me, we found this in a cave, and it's scribbled on the wall. And it looks like someone is, think about you found like in a middle school bathroom, okay? Is essentially what you have on the wall. But this dates from the 1st or 2nd century AD. And it's someone making fun of this guy named Alexamenos, okay? And what's written here in Greek is here's Alexamenos worshiping his god, okay? The problem, or the interesting thing about the idea that whoever wrote this was a very common way of making fun of Christians, to portray Jesus with the head of a donkey. I might say a bad word here in a minute, just so you guys know, on accident, because it's what he says in Tertullian says. It was very common that Jesus was portrayed with the head of a donkey. It was one of the ways that the secularists would make fun of Christians for possibly thinking it was worth worshiping a Savior who was willing to die. It was such a foreign concept, which ties all of the humility of Jesus, which coming into a Roman and Greek culture where it was all about, right? If you were a Roman general, centurion, or you rode on a white horse, you rode into battle, you never got your outfit dirty, everyone served you, you had sex slaves, you were in charge of everything, you were the high and mighty one, everyone else bowed and knelt to you. At the sound of your voice, you could kill whoever you wanted to kill, and yet you have Jesus, the King of the universe, riding on a donkey, henceforth the donkey head, and then going so low as to be abused, humiliated, and crucified. So early Christians were made fun of because the idea of a suffering servant was such an affront to their Hellenistic senses that they mocked him. So this is the first image we have of Jesus being a crucifixion victim. We had stories about it, obviously. We had manuscript evidence of all of it. But this is the first thing we have of someone drawing a picture of Jesus with the donkey's head on a cross. Here's what Tertullian tells us that gives us a little bit of background. Tertullian being a church father. "For some among you have dreamed that our God is a donkey's head, an absurdity which Cornelius Tacitus first suggested. He relates that the Jews in their migration in the desert, when suffering for want of water, escaped by following for guides some wild donkeys, which they supposed to be going on in quest of water after pasture. And that on this account of the image of one of these animals was worshipped by the Jews. From this, I suppose, it was presumed that we too, from our close connection with the Jewish religion, have ours consecrated under the same emblematic form. So he's saying, if any of you guys see a picture of a donkey on a cross, the reason why is because there's a conflation now of who Jesus was and this emblem of humiliation that have now gone together. This is to be expected as people are making fun of us as Christians. The fall of Tyre, this one's an interesting story. We talked about it this last summer because it is both prophecy, history, and archaeology. We know that in the year 332, a man named Alexander the Great laid siege to Tyre. In Ezekiel chapter 26, Ezekiel makes a prediction that there would come a fall of a city named Tyre. The city of Tyre was so powerful and formidable that it was believed by some people that it would never fall. The interesting part about Tyre's geography, I'll see if I can show you here in a second, is that Tyre actually had two different areas which made it almost impossible to defeat. Old Tyre, which was kind of what we called coastal Tyre, was this inner sanctum in here that was protected all around, where the only way you could approach them was the sea. And they weren't like their Phoenician cousins at this time. You didn't approach people from sea. They weren't a seafaring people, the Alexandrian army or even the Babylonians especially. So Nebuchadnezzar comes and tries to lay waste to Tyre. And so what do the Tyrrhenians do? They get in boats and they say, take it. And they boat out to here, to the island of Tyre, and they just party it up. They see Nebuchadnezzar and the army on, and they're like, hi, you can't get here. Y'all don't know how to sail. Sorry about that. So they waited until Nebuchadnezzar got ripe and angry, even though he took all this over here. Then after they leave, they go back over, they rebuild the coastal city. So the idea was, no one's ever going to be able to beat these dudes. Because they're seafarers, and every time you come and approach them, they can just retreat to their island. How are you ever going to beat them? So Ezekiel makes a bold prediction. I am against you, Tyre, and I will bring many nations against you, like the sea casting up its waves. They will destroy the walls of Tyre and pull down her towers. I will scrape away her rubble and make her a bare rock. Out in the sea, this is interesting, out in the sea she will become a place to spread fish nets. How do you spread fish nets out in the sea? For I have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. She will become plunder for the nations. They will plunder your wealth and loot your merchandise. They will break down your walls and demolish your fine houses and throw your stones, timber, and rubble into the sea. There we go. I will put an end to your noisy songs, and the music of your harps will be heard no more. I will make you a bare rock, and you will become a place to spread fish nets. You will never be rebuilt, for I, the Lord, have spoken, declares the sovereign Lord. So, in the Babylonian conquest, this is written in 593, in the Babylonian conquest, circa 583, whatever it is, 10, 15 years later, they go down and everyone goes, oh, a failed prophecy. You said they were going to destroy everything. And the Tyrrhenians think it's funny because after hearing the prophecy, they went, we're still standing. And Ezekiel seems to indicate, yeah, we're not done yet. The prophecy isn't over yet. Because what happens in 332, a man named Alexander the Great is humiliated and insulted because after he takes the city of Old Tyre, just like Nebuchadnezzar did, they flee back out to their island and go, ha ha ha, you can't get us. You don't know how to fare the seas either. We are safe. This is going to be fine. And after a long siege, Alexander gets a plan. He takes their city, turns it into rubble, throws the rubble into the water, and throws all of their rocks and all of their wood and everything else and all of their gold, everything, and he actually builds an underwater bridge by stacking everything in it that the people up to their knees and ankles can walk step by step. They throw more rubble in, and he builds a causeway from Old Tyre out to Tyre. And then, after doing that, if you look at a modern day picture of the city of Tyre, it was such a robust thing that they built, they've actually just constructed a city around it, which is not the city of Tyre anymore. Nothing about Tyre exists anymore. It was completely demolished. But this area of earth is now inhabited, and it looks like this today. So this is everything that they made. This used to be underwater until they crushed the coastal city of Tyre. They leveled everything, made it here as a causeway, and came out and killed all the Tyrrhenians and laid waste to all of them. Which is, in the whole history of mankind and all the battles that we know of, this is unique. The thing that makes it so interesting is 300 years before any of this took place, you will become a place to spread out fish nets. The stones, timber, and rubble will be thrown into the sea. It will make you like a bare rock. And that's exactly what happened. The causeway right here that was built is where people would go, and guess what it became? A place where you fished from, because you got to be out in the middle of the ocean while still standing. It made a great fishing spot. So the fall of Tyre is both. It works as prophecy and it works as that. Here's the next thing we're talking about here for a second, which is the following prophecies are all Christological. That means they have to do with Jesus, okay? So the Old Testament word for Messiah is Mashiach, okay? That means the one, the coming king, the anointed one, the one we've been waiting for. Again, Rambam, 13 principles, Rambam is the rabbi. 13 principles and tenets of Judaism is that we wait every day for Messiah. So they would tell these stories about what Messiah is going to do, and God, through prophets, said, here's what you can expect to see when it happens. Some things to note with everything we're going to be talking about here in a second. Number one, we won't mention a single prophecy that Jesus could have had control over, okay? So if a prophecy is he will wear Nikes every day of his life, he could have learned the prophecy and done that, right? That doesn't mean anything to me. That's how skeptical I am. I'm going, no. I don't want anything that he could play an active role in fulfilling. I only want the prophecies that were done to him, the things that he couldn't control, the things outside of his purview. So I don't even want the things like he's going to heal people or he's going to exorcise demons, because he could at least trick people and make them think that. I want the minimalist facts. I want the things that secularists and Christians can agree on about the historicity of this character, Jesus. I'm going to give you 31 of 400, this should say 65. 65 Christological prophecies. Another thing to notice, people will say, well, you Gentiles or you Christians baked these in later on. None of the prophecies that we're going to talk about here in a second existed outside of the Jewish canon of Scripture prior to the time where Jesus showed up. These aren't Christian inventions. These aren't Gentile insertions. These are Jewish institutions. This is what the Jews held in their Bible. This is what the Jews were expecting Messiah to be. Christians had no interplay with this, and we'll talk about that here in a second with the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls preserve the prophecies which remained untouched through Jesus' whole life. So, here's why this is important. I need the high schoolers to help me here. Where are you? Yeah, okay. What's your name? Ethan. Hi. You enjoying your food? Good. Ethan, if I said, on the count of 3, you tell me your birthday, would you be willing to be honest about your birthday? Okay. On the count of 3, you tell me your birthday, and I'm going to predict what you're going to say. Ready? Just give me the month to start out with on the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. September. Yeah. Yeah. All right. I'm thinking of either the first 15 days of the month or the last 15 days of the month. Is it in the first 15 or the second 15? I knew that. So I'm going to put this one away. I'm just going to keep this one. If I open my hand, it's because it's in the last 5 days of the month. If it's in any time before the last 5 days, I'm going to keep my hand shut. Okay? Don't worry about it. Just, when's your birthday? What day of the month? 25th? See how I kept my hand closed? It's because I knew what you were going to say. Did you like that? So September 25th. That's pretty good, huh? Everything I did meant nothing, right? Because what I'm doing is, what I'm capable of doing in a situation like that is I'm capable of gaining information, and then I'm able to actually rearrange what I'm saying in such a way that it could look like prophecy if I waited until Ethan told me his birth date, and then I went and I wrote a script saying, there will be a man in the third row, he'll be eating food, and his name will be Ethan, and on the 27th day of September, he was born. If I find all that information out, and then I write that, that's not prophecy, that's biography, right? That's nothing more than prose. That's nothing more than giving information after the fact. So what's really important is for us to be able to show and demonstrate that the prophecies that are about Jesus went untouched. That through his life, no one was able to manipulate them or to change them or to alter them. And something really shocking happened in the 1950s and the 1960s, particularly in 1947 when the first cave was discovered. In Qumran, a goat herder was trying to find a goat that went into a cave in the Bedouin community in Qumran, which is on the south side of the Dead Sea. North side? No one knows. Anyway, he takes a rock because he's trying to hit the goat to get him out of the cave, and he throws a rock into the cave and he hits some kind of jar, some piece of pottery, and he hears a shatter, which that's not the sound that goats make when you hit them, by the way, if you're new to goats. So he goes up and he explores, and he finds just pottery and pottery and pottery, filled, vases and urns and pottery filled with texts. All in all, they find thousands of manuscripts of documents preserved in antiquity. This community, which is better known as the Essene community, which was in this Bedouin tribe out here in Qumran, they were defectors of Judaism that believed that there was they were kind of a sectarian group that went against a lot of the teachings that the Jews were holding to at that time. Namely, they didn't want to sacrifice animals. Some people think they were dispelled because they went against some of the teachings of Judaism. They were more fundamentalist, right? In this whole community, it was typically understood that they were just males. So there was almost no archaeology found of females, no archaeology found of kids. So it was a group of guys who went out in the desert and decided, hey, you're going to do your thing. So they went out there, and so whether they had wives that they went back to, but they were just concerned with one thing: accurately transmitting these different documents and then preserving them. When they found out that Rome is being taken over, they either flee from the community or they are overtaken, but they decide they're going to hide all these manuscripts that they've been copying for generations in caves, all these caves all over Qumran, so people can't find them. But this community wrote these things in about 250 BC, and the documents they're writing, Isaiah, Psalms, those things, date back 1,000 years before. So they're collecting manuscripts from thousands of years previously. They themselves are copying them in 250 BC. And then with the incoming group of people, they hide these documents in caves, and then they book it, and no one touches them until 1947. So before Jesus shows up on the scene, they get buried. This is why this Ethan thing makes sense. It wasn't contemporaneous with the story of Jesus. No one touched these things. You will not find a historian who, A, believes that anyone ever touched the Dead Sea Scrolls, that they were manipulated in any way. To think that you can go in and find 2,000-year-old papyrus and you can pick it up and change things in it is the most backwards idea possible. Or that even if they're planted in 250 BC or 200 BC or 150 BC, that people after Jesus' time could come into a Jewish sect, could find these things, and instead of going look at them, they would bury them back in a cave? Nothing makes sense. There's no historian who doesn't believe in this pattern and timeline. The Essenes come, they take these manuscripts of old, they retranslate them, and they have transmissions and manuscript evidence over and over and over again. They bury them in caves. No one touches them until 1947. They're completely excavated. Even to this day, they're still looking for other things, but about 1965. So in a period of 20 some odd years, they're doing their due diligence to find everything that's in there. Inside of the Dead Sea Scrolls are things like Isaiah, which is the great Isaiah scroll or the great Psalm scroll, where whole swaths, if not whole books of the Old Testament are perfectly preserved. And inside of Psalms, which is what Jesus says in the New Testament, the book of Luke, Jesus says, everything that you've read about in the Hebrew scriptures, namely the prophets and the Psalms, point to me. Which a lot of us, when we think about the Psalms, we don't think of prophecy, do we? But Jesus seemed to insinuate that he came to fulfill the things that were in the Psalms. The cool thing about that is the argument could be made, well, after Jesus came, they went and they changed all the Psalms. The Dead Sea Scrolls take that argument away in spades. Not only is there no proof that anyone has doctored any documents, but this is the pièce de résistance. You just can't touch it. The argument is dead. That anyone could change a prophecy to fit Jesus is conclusively expelled by the Dead Sea Scrolls. Because changing it would be absolutely impossible unless you think that that goat herder went in, learned all those different languages, changed them, wrapped them back up, and didn't break anything, which it doesn't make any sense. So, the numbers that we're going to talk about with the improbability of these prophecies being fulfilled by someone haphazardly or by chance, all of those numbers are going to be given by secular scientists, namely the American Science Association. So, these aren't Christians saying this. The probability of one man fulfilling these things, even the provable things that we're able to do, which is what we're going to talk about here in a second. These are minimalist facts, okay? So what am I talking about specifically? Here's just some of the 31 of the 465 things about Jesus in particular. Namely, the background to make sure that people don't miss who Jesus is all throughout the Old Testament. I'll give you a few things. Genesis 3 begins, this is the proto-evangelion, he will be a male seed. When God says he's going to save his people and he's going to bring them back to himself and he is going to end the war between God and man, he starts by saying, it's almost like a documentary that slowly unveils the culprit over time, but then you have this corpus and this body of evidence by the end to go, this is exactly who it was, right? Down to like their DNA profile and everything else. So Genesis 3:15 starts very meekly, very broadly, okay? 117 billion people have ever lived. And in the first verse of, in the first evangelical statement of the Bible, Genesis 3:15, it takes out half of them, okay? It'll be a man. Now at that point, you could have expected maybe God's going to send an angel. God's going to send a chicken. God's going to send. So while it's not uber specific, it does cancel out a whole swath of other people, including the New Testament Gnostics, who think that maybe Jesus was an angel, or that the Jehovah's Witnesses who think that Jesus was the archangel. That there's a lot of things that this actually does for us. But the very first thing the Bible indicates on who Messiah is going to be, the prophecy is it's going to be a human male. And then it says specifically of the woman's seed, through the woman, not the man. The sin comes through man, right? But the promise comes through the woman. So it was important that Jesus was born of a virgin, because if Jesus was born in the same way that mankind is born, he would have inherited man's original sin. But because Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit, original sin didn't pass to him. So Genesis 3:15 insinuates here that the woman's seed, not seeds, and not the man's, will bring the end of the war between the serpent and the man. Genesis 12, verse 3, God begins to hone in on how this is going to happen. He picks a man named Abraham, and he says, through your lineage, all will be blessed. But Father Abraham had many sons, and many sons had Father Abraham. I'm one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. Right arm, right foot, left foot. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you've missed out. I also want to talk to you about VeggieTales later, but we don't have time. Okay. Going to be through Abraham. Well, Abraham, which child through Abraham? The lineage can have, you have Isaac. Well, Isaac had more than one kid. Okay, good. It's going to be through Jacob. But Jacob, there's 12 tribes of Jacob, right? Reuben, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Issachar, Zebulun. Which tribe? It's going to be through the lineage of Judah, the kingly lineage. The scepter is going to depart in 70 AD, so the Messiah needs to come before then. This is what this tells us. Isaiah 11, verse 10, he'll be of the lineage then of Jesse. So you see like this family tree that goes back to like at the beginning is whatever half of 117 billion people is. And you cancel out half. It's going to be a man. Then it gets really small from the lineage of Abraham. Then it gets smaller of Isaac, of Jacob, of Judah, of Jesse, of David. And so the text is trying to tell you, you don't need to look very broadly. I'll tell you exactly who's going to be giving birth to this Messiah. Through Judah, lineage of Jesse, lineage of David, right? Why was Jesus born in Bethlehem? Because his father, David's father, Jesse, he was establishing the city of Bethlehem. That's where Jesse and David were from. And so because Jesus' parents were from the lineage of David, they had to go back to David's hometown, right? They had to go to the city of Bethlehem because that's where their lineage is from. So that's why they're getting counted there. Hosea 11, verse 1, he'd be called out of Egypt. So when Jesus is born, because of Herod, they go to Egypt to flee. Then angel tells them to go hide themselves in Egypt. He's going to be brought out of Egypt, which is very interesting that he'd be born. Micah tells us, chapter 5, verse 2, in the city of Bethlehem. Okay, it uses specific names of a specific place. It doesn't just say this region. He'll be from Bethlehem, Beit Lechem in the Hebrew, which means the house of bread. Which is interesting because as Jesus gets older, he's going to call himself the bread of life. So where is he from? He's from the bread house. Okay, so he's from the panandaria. He's from the bakery. He's from the house of bread. So he's going to be born in the house of bread of the lineage of David and Jesse and Jacob and Isaac, the lineage of the patriarch Abraham, but he's going to be called out of Egypt. So how are you born in Bethlehem, but then you're called out of Egypt? This is the exact history of Jesus. So this is who he is. Now let's look at the prophecies of what he will do. Numbers 9, verse 12 and Psalm 34. He's not going to have a bone broken in his body. Again, he's not responsible for that, right? When he's on the cross, it was tradition that you would break the guy's legs so they would die quicker. He's not when they said, don't break his legs, he wasn't like, please, no, break the legs. He didn't happen like that. I don't know why he was Italian on the cross, but hey, say, please, it's a me. Okay. Job 19, 27 to 23 to 27, he's going to be resurrected. Psalm chapter 22. We might jump into this here in a little bit because I think it's the most powerful and convincing argument. He's going to be crucified. There's going to be lots cast for his garments. He'll be surrounded by criminals at his death. He'll be buried with the rich. You don't vote on that. Like Roman soldiers weren't interested in your last rites, right? They were like, so where would you like to be crucified? He's like, encircled by bandits. And I want people to cast lots for my garments. That didn't happen. Psalm 38, verse 11, his friends would reject him. He can't control that. Psalm 40, verse 14, confronted by adversaries in the garden. Psalm 41, verse 9, betrayed by a familiar friend. Isaiah 7:14, born of a virgin. Zechariah 9, verse 9, greeted with rejoicing in Jerusalem when he comes in. Zechariah 11, 12 through 13, betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. That is going to be used to buy a field where the poor are going to be buried. That one's really interesting and very specific. The American Scientific Association put the probability of each of these things with nominal numbers. They said, what are the odds that a man could predict hundreds of years ahead of time that whoever Messiah was would be sold for 30 pieces of silver, that money would be cast into the temple, and then that money would be used to buy a potter's field in order to bury the poor? This was the prediction. This is exactly what happens. Jesus is betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, which the Old Testament says is the price of a dying servant, back from the book of Leviticus. So he's betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. Judas, feeling guilty about this, gives the money back. They don't want it. He throws it into the temple because it's blood money. And they said, well, we can't put it in the treasury because this is blood money. So they use it to buy the potter's field. The American Scientific Association, they're so careful and they're so conservative with their numbers. If I asked you, what are the odds that if I said Messiah is coming in 2820, how is he going to live? How is he going to die? What's he going to do? What's it going to take? Is he going to die? Will he live forever? The idea really was that he would never die. He would come as a conquering servant. He would conquering hero, never be. So, and you had to predict, and for some reason, because you enjoy specificity, you say he'll be crucified after being betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. That money will be used to buy a potter's field. And so when you ask, what are the odds of someone randomly in history being betrayed by a friend, 30 pieces of silver, money bought the potter's field, the number he came to was 1 in 10 to the 13th power, which might seem like a big number to you. But in my estimation, that's remarkably small, right? The answer should be no one predicts that haphazardly, right? If anything happens like that, you just go, you must have known, you're cheating, is what you would have come to the conclusion of. Now, What about specificity of time? When is this going to happen? Genesis 49, verse 10. Before the scepter leaves Judah. That happens in 70 AD. So Messiah must come and complete his mission before 70 AD. Numbers 24, verse 17. We shall see him in the future. So it's after 1400 BC. Daniel 9, verse 26. He's going to be killed before the destruction of the temple. And this is the craziest one. You can throw all the rest of that stuff out. In Daniel chapter 9, verse 25, there's a prediction where we're told Daniel, who's prophesying about the coming of Jesus, he says, from the beginning of the establishment of the temple, which is a decree given by Artaxerxes in 444 BC, there will be from that time on the 1st of Nisan in 444 BC, which was the month, which translates about March 5th in our solar calendar. They have a lunar calendar, which is different than ours. He says, from the day that the Artaxerxes makes this declaration, I want you to count 173,880 days. That's what the text says. Well, 173,880 days, 80 days from the 1st of Nisan in 444 BC, if you do the math, comes to the date of March 30th in the year 33 AD. So it's which is the beginning of the week of Passover, and it says after that, in the following 7, which is the following week, that's when the Messiah will be crucified. So the entrance that he makes is predicted to the exact day, and then it says within a week he will be crucified, which is exactly what takes place. So this all might be disinteresting to you, but you've got to do something with this. Because it doesn't matter who you are, you have to come to a conclusion on why a guy with all this stuff buried in the Dead Sea in Qumran is able to predict the exact number of days from the beginning of the establishment of the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem through Nehemiah and Artaxerxes, why someone could predict to the day exactly when all this was going to take place. So if you take these numbers, these are the numbers that are given to them: death by crucifixion, buying of coins in a field, it's 10 to the 11th power. That's less than I said. But you have to add these things together. That he'd be born in Bethlehem of all places. The number that was assigned is 1 in 10 to the 5th power. That still seems unreasonably small. 117 billion people have ever existed. And the fact that he would be born in Bethlehem, which is a city that hasn't even always existed, and that what percentage of all people born are born in Bethlehem? That's really the number that you need to get to. The coins in the field, the death by crucifixion. Again, this is the American Scientific Association who validates all of these numbers. If you just take these 8 prophecies, of which there's 465, those are just Christological, of which there's 1,980 total, the odds of just these 8 happening by chance is 1 in 10 to the 80th power, which is the same as the number of atoms in our universe, okay? So once again, in order for this to happen by chance, you would need to paint a single atom in the universe red, go on a blindfolded mission to by chance grab that one red atom, and an atom is to an orange what an orange is to planet Earth. And the universe is 13.75 billion years across, billion light years across. And it's the nuclear density of all of those planets and stars and systems and everything put together. One atom would be what you'd have to find, and it'd have to be the right one for 8 of them to happen, and yet we've got evidence that the number far supersedes all that, 465, just with Jesus. Oh, man. Guys, we're never going to have time for all this stuff. This is super interesting, and we're not going to listen to it. It's good. It's good stuff. If you guys want this afterwards, you can email me, and I'll send it to you. You can do it in your own time. Oh, man, this is so good. I love this stuff. Okay, let's get to a little bit of archaeology. This is in John chapter 9, verse 6 through 7. He smeared the mud on the blind man's eyes and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which is translated sent. So the blind man went away and washed and came back seeing. They hadn't found this, which led scholars to say that there wasn't a pool of Siloam and that John was using a religious conceit to illustrate a point. That's great, except then we found the pool of Siloam when someone was digging up an old sewage pipe. And this is the pool of Siloam. You can go visit to this day. It's beautiful. Hezekiah blocked up the upper spring of Gihon and brought the water down through a tunnel to the west side of the city of David. So they were being besieged. And during the siege, Hezekiah said, in order to get water in from the Gihon spring, this is what they had to do. They're up on a mountain up here, and the temple in Jerusalem is placed up here. They needed water from the Gihon spring, which is down here. But they couldn't go outside the city because that's where everyone was trying to murder them. So what they did is they, by night, snuck out some people and started excavating inwards, and the people at the top of the mountain, and we're talking about a long distance, they start from two different places, and with no modern equipment or anything, just started digging towards each other underground. Could you imagine how improbable it would be for you to start somewhere and without any instrumentation at night to dig and hit exactly where the other people were? Like, how would you even do that? And you have to be quiet too. You can't be like, hey, Bill, how close are we? You just got to keep going. So they thought this was all erroneous because there's no way this could have happened. The math showed this was impossible. Okay? Then, that's neat. It's called Hezekiah's Tunnel. In Hezekiah's Tunnel, the people who actually met in the middle were so impressed by themselves that they wrote an inscription on the wall. And here's what it says. This is the narrative of the tunneling. While the stonecutters were wielding the picks, each toward his coworker, and while there were still 3 cubits to tunnel through, the voice of a man was heard calling out for his coworker because there was a fissure in the rock running from the south, and to this, in the final day of tunneling, each of the stonecutters were striking. So you see these little breaks, because parts of it get chipped off, forcefully as to meet his coworker, pick after pick. And then the water began to flow from the source to the pool, a distance of 1,200 cubits, and 100 cubits was the height of the rock above the head of the stonecutters. So they were so impressed by themselves that they had dug Hezekiah's tunnel, they wrote it on the wall and said, would you look at that? So there really was no argument. Today you can walk through Hezekiah's tunnel and see all this stuff for yourself. Hezekiah's tunnel, though, is scary. Okay, I'm just telling you. Certain parts, you're like up to your neck in water and it's pitch dark. So you're like walking through and then you go underwater sometimes, you have to go. Sometimes the school kids too, they want to run through and they don't realize you're an American and you're terrified. So like, go, mister, go. And you're like, shut up. Caiaphas, it was questionable that he existed. We found his bone box also. This is kind of the conclusion of this. Dr. Nelson Glick, considered the father of modern archaeology. After 23,000 archaeological digs, it may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm clear outline or exact detail historical statements in the Bible. So, with that, again, it's an infinitesimal smattering of things that can give us confidence in what we're talking about. If you have more interest in that, there's a lot more that you can find. Make sure you go to scholarly journal articles to help understand more about archaeology and prophecy and things like that. But that's just a little snapshot into the confidence we have for the veracity of Scripture. I'm going to invite Sarah up, who's going to give some direction on our little break here, heading into our Q&A time, so I'll hand it over to you.
So in just a few moments, we're going to take a quick break. You can use the restroom. There's one right out here. And then I believe we're opening up the one across the courtyard in that family center building if it gets blocked up over there. And then we've got some snacks out in the lobby. And now's a great time. If you have any of those questions that got sparked throughout this whole first hour, please just text them in. That number is 619-732-3077. And I'll get to filter through those, and we can have a great time of Q&A when we come back in just a little bit. So you see you guys in like 2 or 3 minutes. We're going to continue in this time and have Q&A. And so if you were one of those people who texted in with your question and your name, just be alert. I'm going to be calling some names, and we're going to have people walking a microphone over to you so you can ask that question yourself and maybe have some dialogue if you need to elaborate. So just to start off, can we have Jacqueline, Michelle, and Ryan? If you ask questions, can you just pop your hand up and we'll have someone head towards you. We'll start with Jacqueline.
I'm forgetting how I worded it, but I think essentially people have asked me in the past, how do you know that the other lost books or the non-canonized books that are similarly aged of the same kind of time frame, how do you know that the right books got into the canon? And anyway, they asked.
Yeah, that's good word usage. We call it canonicity, or the study of why we trust and hold to the 66 canonical books of the Old and New Testament. The word canon, it is something used to shoot cannonballs, but it's more appropriately used in this context to mean a measuring stick. And so the idea is, why do you accept Genesis through Revelation and those books and you disclude other ones? There's a number of reasons. The first thing is that we actually have a test of canonicity, which we'll talk about here in a second. But I think the argument that often comes in is this idea at some council in the 300s, be it Nicaea, anything else like that, that a group of people got in a room with hundreds of documents on the table and said, which ones do we like the best? And then they pick and chose, and they came up, this is like Dan Brown's argument. Dan Brown's argument in the Da Vinci Code is there's these other gospels, and just because they contain weird information, we reject them. But that's just horrible history when it comes down to it. Here's what I want you to imagine. I want you to imagine that you and your family have like a photo album from when you were a kid. So you went on a really important trip for you and your family to the Ozarks when you were 13 years old. And every year around the same time you went in September, and you go back and you look through that binder. And you've started inviting me over to your house every year to look through that binder of all your photos and your Polaroids and everything else like that. And as you do, one time you're flipping through it and you notice that I have a picture in my hand of me at the Ozarks without you, and I just start slipping it into your photo album. And you go, what are you doing? And I'm like, well, what do you mean? This one's fine. This is me. This is when we went to the Ozarks together. Your family, which has been telling the same story and doing the same thing, and you have the same anecdotes from when your canoe tipped over when you were trying to, you have the same thing all times. And then I start going, oh, no. Like, I was there. This is me in this. And so the idea is the conflationary history, the revisionist history, says that the canonization of Scripture was a bunch of people who decided whatever was going to work best for them. The truth of the matter is that the idea of a completed Old Testament canon and the idea of the agreed upon books of the Old and the New Testament were something that was universally accepted by all people until it became convenient, particularly for the Catholic Church, to begin to insert that in response to the Protestant Reformation. The first time that the Apocrypha is accepted by Catholics is in 1546. That's the first time that it's canonized. Before then, you talk about Jerome, you talk about these other people, just because it makes itself from the Masoretic text or from the Septuagint does not make it in any way authoritative. So the Jewish scholars of the time, you will not find a Jewish scholar ever who has accepted any of the books of the Apocrypha. It doesn't pass the test of canonicity for any of them. It's not accepted. Jewish scholars reject it. Catholic scholars reject it until here comes Martin Luther and the Protestant Reformation. They'd been circling around, but then Catholicism said, well, we're going to make a distinctive apart from this new Protestant group, and we're going to accuse them of getting rid of certain books or not accepting certain books. And so they used the Apocrypha kind of as a selling point for this belief system because they were really getting hammered with the whole selling of indulgences and Tetzelism and moving all these things and Martin Luther's 95 Theses when he said, we got to stop doing this. So it was a response to all those things. When you actually go back and do the history of all of that, not just believing the sound bites and extremes, what you're going to find is the test of canonicity is this. I'm going to use the word Catholic, but I mean it in the universal sense. I use the acronym CORAL when I'm teaching it to my students about the church history, which is in order for a book to be accepted as authoritative, first of all, it was so widely agreed upon what these books were and what these books weren't, right? Like I said, you can reconstruct the entire New Testament just from correspondences between church fathers. They were writing commentaries on the books of the Bible. You don't find any commentaries on these other, but they're just rejected. It would be the same thing as if you had a photo album that someone all of a sudden said, let's add these things into it. The councils that they're talking about where they say the Bible was compiled is just when the Bible was codified. Like we have to remember, when the Bible was originally compiled, when it wasn't a book, it was a collection of scrolls. So some scrolls were being used and they were talking about it like the sacred text. They were referencing it with great laud. They were being careful with those things. They were calling them divine. They were living out these things. And there were other scrolls that no one really cared anything about. The ones that they all universally agreed that were going on at that time were the ones that when people started challenging them, they got together and said, wow, we all thought this was obvious. It's our family photo album. But it's probably better put pen to paper after all because we got people trying to sneak new gospels in, and the Gospel of Thomas, which has the cross announcing Jesus' resurrection on a piece of wood, and Mary Magdalene, the Gospel of Mary, which tells a whole different story, and it's so late, and it's 4th, 5th century, that they say, fine, we'll put down in writing exactly the books that we mean when we say canon. It wasn't when it was established. It was when, it would be like if you stamped your photo album at your house, for me, the Hilken family trip to the Ozarks, 1995. And your family would have gone, did you need to do that? No. But when people start putting pictures in that don't belong there, I do. That's what happened in these different councils. It wasn't the establishment of them. It was the codification of what was already understood. For a book to pass canonization, it needs to be Catholic. That means universally accepted. It needs to be, O stands for Orthodox. It means it's in line with the rest of the accepted scriptures. So if the Gospel of Mary says that Jesus had wives and did all this other stuff, or the teaching of purgatory throughout the Apocrypha, it goes against everything that was already accepted. The third is relevance. It has to tell the story of the meta-narrative of the restoration of God's kingdom through Jesus the Messiah. It has to be apostolistic, which means it needs to be written by an apostle or a contemporary of an apostle. The apostle just a sent one. It doesn't necessarily mean disciple, but one who was commissioned in Matthew 28 or a contemporary of such. And lastly, it needs to be longevous, which means it has to be first century. It has to be within the time frame of the eyewitnesses. That was kind of the codification that came up with that they said, if something wants to be inserted after we say this is the family album, it needs to pass all these things, and none of those books pass. And none of the other texts pass, and none of those other things are relevant to what's going on, which doesn't even mean that some of them aren't true, like the Maccabean revolt. Everyone believes the Maccabean revolt happened, but if it's not telling the story of the restoration of God's kingdom through his servant Jesus, the Son of God coming man, and then it just doesn't belong in there. There's other historical documents that aren't biblical just because they're historical and true. But that's why we would reject them as evangelicals, but we also reject the story of a group of Christians got together and decided, what should we call canon? I like that one, I like that one, I like that one. So it was a very careful process, and the codification of Nicaea was not the establishment of it, it was the codification of what was already understood. So, does that answer your question? Probably too long of an answer, if I'm being honest.
Well, that's an interesting distinction between Catholic as universal church versus when we hear Catholic today, we think of the Catholicism as a religion. And yeah. Michelle, you had a question related to that. You want to go ahead?
Well, I mean, I think you kind of answered it, but there is a few books in the Catholic Bible that is different than ours, or that is an addition to ours. Can you explain why?
Yeah, that's primarily why. And again, even Catholicism, which talks on church history so much, when you go back and you look at some of their early scholars like Jerome, they totally rejected it. And these things which were supposed to be inserted into the Old Testament canon are rejected by, it's not just that, there's historical errors in them, there's theological errors in them, there are errors of every type and sort. They're not longevous, they're not Catholic, they're Catholic. They're Catholic in the big C Roman Catholic idea, but they're not Catholic, meaning they're not universally accepted. So like for the book of Judith, okay, it's old enough, but it's also written during the period of silence where the prophets in the New Testament all agrees that there were no prophets during the period of silence, the 400-year period, and it was written during that period of time. Not only that, when it starts, it talks about kings ruling in territories that they didn't rule in, and that the capital of this territory was this, which it wasn't, and the king of this territory was this, which it wasn't. So it makes a lot of historical errors. Secondly, the New Testament never quotes any book of the Apocrypha, even though it quotes the Old Testament hundreds of times. Jesus actually bookends the Old Testament when he talks about the first martyr and the first prophet and the last martyr and the last prophet of the Old Testament. He bookends it, right? So he talks about from Abel all the way back to the end of the New Testament, or the end of the Old Testament. And in the intertestamental period, why did he reject all those things? Jesus doesn't quote it. The early church fathers aren't quoting it. It doesn't pass the test of canonicity. The New Testament doesn't refer to it as anything. The early Catholic scholars rejected it. So, and it's written a lot of it's written during the period of silence when there was universal belief that the prophets weren't speaking. So it's not that it might not be important or it might not be informative, but the errors that we find, both theologically and historically speaking, and the time period that it's written in, and the rejection of Jesus in referring to them, and the rejection of the whole New Testament in quoting them, I think gives us really good reason to believe that they are additions that shouldn't be authoritative. That's the Protestant position anyway.
All right, we're going to have a few more questions. Dustin, Helen, can you guys raise your hands and we'll have a mic sent over to you up here and up here. Ryan answered it, or asked a question kind of in that similar line of thought from those last few. Did that kind of answer your question, Ryan, wherever you're at? All right. Well, we'll move on with Dustin. You ready?
Yeah. How and why do modern day Judaism interpret/reject these prophecies that clearly pointed to Jesus?
That's a really good question. Why would, if there's such robust evidence for Jesus being Messiah, why would you reject Jesus as Messiah? I think to recognize that first and foremost, it is not a universal Jewish idea that Jesus is rejected. There's whole movements of Messianic Judaism, not to mention everyone at Easter was a Jew who became a Christian because they were all Jews. So it's not a universal thing. I would say, I love the way that Paul writes in the New Testament. The story of Jesus is a stumbling block for the Jews. The idea that Jesus would turn the whole Jewish system on its head, and for some people is such an affront, like the picture of the donkey's head on the body, the conquering and reigning Messiah who's going to come in, but he's going to humble himself to be born in Bethlehem, right? When the Jews hear that he's from Nazareth, what do they say? What good comes from Nazareth? I think when you get in your mind this idea of what Messiah is going to be, what Messiah ought to be, and instead you get a peasant who hangs out with fishermen, who turns the world on its head through a message of love and self-sacrifice and servitude and brokenness and humiliation and the suffering servant of Isaiah 53. There can be a sense in which, even if the facts point to something, it has so gone against expectation that you're not really willing to accept it on its own. When I go to Israel, our tour guides, both times that I've gone, have been Jewish, non-Messianic Jews. They'll tell you the stories. It's not that they don't think these things happened. They're going to also hold to a couple of, how do we know that Jesus is coming back again? Who told us that? Jesus did. So if you have a list of prophecies that have yet to be fulfilled, and the Jewish idea was that when Jesus comes, he's going to fulfill all prophecies, and when he comes, he says, I'm coming back to fulfill the rest of these prophecies, but you don't believe in Jesus' original coming as the Messiah, and then he venerates the fact that he's going to be fulfilling them in the future, you would look at Jesus and go, look, you have hundreds of prophecies that you didn't fulfill. To which we go, for sure, those are still laid. Like the idea of bringing peace throughout all of the Middle East. There's all these things that haven't happened yet, but I think the Christian has really good reason to believe, as Jesus begins to explain and give commentary to the things that haven't been fulfilled, that he is coming back. But that doesn't do much if I don't think that Jesus was the Savior in the first place to be able to tell me that he's coming back. So I reject those ideas. Therefore, I'd have to reject the fact they fulfilled all the prophecies. And if I reject the fact that he's coming back, then he left these unfulfilled, and therefore he's not the Messiah. So if you listen to people like Ben Shapiro or whatever, who are Jews who are talking about the idea, a lot of it is a priori, I think, or they would just say, I'm not compelled by the evidence, or there's a lot of historical reasoning behind it in saying, well, do you really think that people cared where you buried an ancient Near Eastern Jewish carpenter back then? So the fact that the tomb was empty doesn't mean anything. So I think a lot of the times it's not super compelling to me, the reason why some Jewish people don't believe. There is a really interesting and cool movement towards Christianity coming out of Judaism right now. But I think you're going to have some people who are so dyed in the wool, this is what Messiah was going to be. That doesn't matter what Jesus does or what he fulfills. Like when you read Isaiah 53 or you read Psalm 22, which I didn't get to, but I can send you the slides on it, it just seems so, no, I can't get into it. It's too nerdy. But that would be my reasoning. Yeah, good question. And I don't want to speak on behalf of the Jewish nation. That's the conversations that I have had along that line have been similar to that. And again, every Jewish person is going to have a different reason for rejecting it. Those are the ones that I have spoken to personally, or I've watched in like online debates and stuff. So,
All right, we've got Helen, and then next up is going to be Luke. Oh, you're right here, both of you? All right, here, you can just have this mic.
How many prophecies are predicted for the second coming of Jesus, and what are some of them?
Yeah, so the establishment of peace throughout, which I just talked about a second ago, establishment of peace throughout Israel. And here's what's really interesting to me is Psalm 22 keeps coming up. But if you read Psalm 22 in 1000 BC, it would seem like hodgepodge. You wouldn't really know what was going on. Okay, so Psalm 22 starts with my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are your hands so far from me? You turn your face from me. I cry out by day, but you do not hear me. I cry out by night, but you are distant. You've been with me since I was at my mother's breast, but now you are far from me. I am a pack of raging wolves encircles me. The strong bulls of Bashan all around me. I'm encompassed by my enemies. You bear me in the dust with thieves. I'm buried amongst the rich. They pierce my hands and my feet. My heart has turned to wax within me. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd in my mouth. None of that would have made any sense until the crucifixion of Jesus took place. You would have read that for thousands of years, or at least 1,000 years, and as you were trying to preach that message, you would have been like, they pierced my hands and my feet. I mean, you're talking about hundreds of years before crucifixion was even invented. You would have gone, someone's going to get their hands and feet pierced. It seems from chapter 42 and chapter 43 and Psalm 34 and Isaiah 53 and 52 that we're talking about the Messiah figure, but I don't know what it means by piercing feet and everything. But then once it happens, everyone in the audience of what was taking place, this is what Jesus says on the cross. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He's quoting Psalm 22. So he actually turned the attention of everyone in the audience to the prophetic Psalm 22. And as they're remembering in their head what Psalm 22 says, they realize he's fulfilling everything in real time. So the Pharisees freak out. They say he's claiming to be the Messiah. He's claiming to be the prophet. Kill him now. Do away with him. They're literally casting lots for his garments, which is what Psalm 22 predicts. And he's dying, and he's saying, by the way, y'all accidentally did exactly what Psalm 22 said you were going to do, which they didn't appreciate. But so many of the things of the future, when you read like the book of Revelation or you read anything else like that, this is a little bit of an incrimination of the Christian church. And I mean to be nothing but positive towards the church, generally speaking. But imagine if you did like a 32-week sermon series about prophecy in the Old Testament and you stumbled on Psalm 22. What would you have done with it? You would have just said, it'll make sense someday. When Jesus speaks in the book of Mark about his second coming, he says, I have given you all these things as signs so that you will know when it's taking place. We're not really meant to be studying Revelation and all these things so that we can predict when it's going to happen. We're supposed to be doing it so that when it happens, it will be very obvious what's taking place. We have taken towards kind of like putting on our aluminum foil hats and going like, it's going to be next year. That's never the point of prophecy. The point of prophecy is never to go, guess when it's taking place, because you know what Jesus said when he was asked, when's this going to happen? Guess what Jesus said? It's not my business what's going to happen. And then when he says, how is it going to happen? He's going to say, I'm going to come back like a thief in the night. So I think it's interesting when Christians go, Jesus says, who is the great omniscient king of the universe, he's going to come like a thief in the night and no one's going to see it coming. And what do we spend a lot of our time doing? Guessing exactly when it's going to take place. I think this is a misuse of prophecy. It's meant so that when it takes place, all of Christianity would go, it's today. That's the Messiah. He is a false Messiah. This is what it is. I don't think we're really meant to go, there was a war in the Middle East. Here it comes. Now we should be expecting this and that. It's meant so that when Jesus is being crucified, everyone would have gone, oh, they pierced my hands and my feet. I'm encircled by thieves. They bury me in the dust of the earth. My mouth is dried up like a potsherd. Jesus cries out, I'm thirsty. My bones have turned to wax. My heart melts within my skin. This is it. So a lot of the prophecies, I think, do have an element of confusing language in them. Like someone asked the question, do you believe in dragons? What does Revelation mean about this, that, and the other thing? I think when Revelation happens, we're all going to go, it's perfect. It's exactly what I thought it was going to be. But it would have done me no good to try to predict it in the future. So the establishment of his kingdom, the peace between all those people, like obviously the trumpet blast, the separating of the sheep, and the peace that brings to all people. So all those things are still future things to come. Right? Those are things that are especially interesting from a Jewish point of view. And they'll stop you right here. Is there peace in Jerusalem? No, I didn't think so. The scriptures said Messiah was going to bring peace. He didn't do it. Forget it. It wasn't Jesus. So the problem with a lot of those ideas of thinking, in my perspective, is a lot of the Old Testament prophecies about when Messiah was going to come, the timeline's already been broken, right? The scepter has left the lineage of Judah, the breaking down of the temple, all of this. everything that was supposed to also be inside of the Messianic period is also gone. So you actually throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, we don't think it was Jesus, but we actually ran out of time because all the things that the Old Testament predicted timeline-wise, it's already over. So I don't know if that was a great answer to your question. It was a very interesting one. But when it comes to prophecy, I think it helps us become God's welcoming committee, not his prediction committee, which is why here at College Ave, every time we're in the middle of John right now, and I get the question, what book are we going into next? What are we going to do next? Where are we going from here? And the number one thing people want is Revelation. And I go, when it happens, we'll teach Revelation. But until then, we don't need to be in it's time. It's 2 weeks from Thursday, Trump's going to be elected, and we're all, I don't know. There's a long history of people predicting the end of the world and a long history of incorrect answers. So that would be some of them. Thanks, Helen.
I'm going to go ahead, Luke. And then after Luke, we'll have Marcus right over there. All right, go ahead, Luke.
All right, so I have too many questions to ask, but I think the one that most pertains to what you were talking about is you sort of proved or give evidence for the fact that none of these prophecies have been changed and they're all what they originally were. But sort of a two-part question, how do we know that the prophecies in the Old Testament were made before stuff like the Tyre? Like, how do we know the prophecy about Tyre was made before? And then also, how do we know that all of the things that came, like all the things that were said in the New Testament about Jesus being born in Bethlehem, going out of Egypt, being surrounded by all these people, and Judas being selling him out for 30 pieces of silver. How do we know that that's true? And those weren't lied about by people saying, oh, it says there's going to be 30 pieces of silver to be sold for a potter's field, so we're just going to add that. How do we know that those are that didn't happen?
Yeah, Luke, it's a really good question. I think my answer to that would be, in this case, the Jewish ruling authority who had everything to lose in this instance. Jesus is coming and turning their system upside down. He's calling them a brood of vipers, whitewashed sarcophaguses. He's taking over their system. He's Isaiah 61, he gets up and he preaches in the synagogue and he says, today the scriptures have been fulfilled in your hearing. I am the culmination of everything you've been waiting for. They hate him. They hate his movement. They hate everything that he stands for, right? How many times do they try to push him off a cliff or stone him to death or whatever? They just don't like the guy. What we lack would have been the absolute easiest thing ever in the New Testament period is for someone within the lifetime of Jesus, when someone writes down, he was sold for 30 pieces of silver, it would have taken one person, one time, one refutation, and the simplest, most categorically basic thing to do is for someone who served to lose or stood to lose something to simply go, no, he didn't. No. Imagine the whole Sanhedrin. You got 72 people. You've got these Pharisees. You've got James. You've got Paul. You've got all these people, and they all are giving the exact same witness. The response to it, there's actually a decree that goes out right after Jesus' resurrection, or the time of Jesus' resurrection, if you will, called the Nazareth Decree, that from here on, it's a capital punishment to move a body after it's been killed, after it's been a result of treason or capital punishment. So you're looking at all these responses to what took place, and you're coming up with the best explanation. So I think the reason that I would reject the idea of, well, how do we know that he actually didn't do that by the potter's field? The best evidence we have for all of those things is it would have taken such a simplistic response from anyone in the ruling class, anyone in the Sanhedrin, anything. Not to mention the credibility of the eyewitnesses, not to mention the agreement that all the disciples had to walk to their death saying the same thing with a cogent explanation, not to mention the different responses from that historical period that shows what happened when Jesus was resurrected, not to mention that Paul and Luke, who are historians of the first rate, claim that 500 people saw him resurrected. So the preponderance of evidence for is really strong, from manuscript evidence to eyewitnesses, but then also the silence of what would have been the simplest teardown of a revolt ever doesn't take place. You watch people retreating and freaking out and not knowing what to do, but you could have abolished the whole thing by going, here's the dude's body. There wasn't 30 pieces of silver. This doesn't fulfill this prophecy. We don't have a potter's field. This was not the agreed upon price. That's not a dude hanging out there named Judas who sold it for us. These are not the things that took place. That's why the power of creeds within the first 3 to 4 months after Jesus dying were being circulated. That's why the earliest texts that we have show that's what Frederick Kenyon said, or maybe William Albright. We have no reason of dating any gospel past the year AD 80. So if Jesus is crucified in AD 33, and the latest gospel or any New Testament part is written in AD 80, you're talking about within years of that, it would have just taken one person to say, didn't happen. That's not the only evidence. That's one in a long line of good reason we have to believe that those things actually took place. A simple refutation from one person. Or you get Paul, you get James, the brother of Jesus, who changed his tune and ends up worshiping his brother. You get Paul, who is you still have to give an answer to that. You go, well, he wasn't really bought for 30 pieces of silver. So what happened on the road to Damascus that Paul went, you know what I love to do? I'd rather be poor and destitute, broken, snake bitten, shipwrecked, and have my head cut off. That seems like a better way of living than in a religious society to be the absolute elite. It's not that any of that by itself proves that the narrative of the Gospels happened. It's that we really don't have any evidence that says that anything in the Gospels didn't take place. And that would have been so much easier to show. We don't have anything that refutes any of it. So it's abductive reasoning. It's inference to the best conclusion. I think the best conclusion is that those things are accurate. It's a good question.
I will go ahead with Marcus and then Grace. If you can pop your hand up in the back there. Oh, there's 2 Graces.
Oh, no.
You can go to both of them. We'll find out which one had the question I'm thinking of. They're probably both good. Go ahead, Marcus.
I've heard that at some point in the history of the Catholic Church, they manipulated the 10 Commandments to reinforce their embrace of iconography. I think maybe they did away with the thou shalt not make any graven images. Do you know if that's like a valid claim? And if so, do we have evidence of the 10 Commandments that predates the formation of the Catholic Church?
Yeah, 'cause we have manuscript evidence of the 10 Commandments that predates the Catholic Church. I don't know about that conspiracy individualistically, so I wouldn't want to speak on something that I really don't know anything about in terms of that.
I know nothing about it. I've just heard it. So.
Yeah, but the Dead Sea Scrolls would be a great example of that, of something that is codified before, not found until the 1940s, and would still have a lot of those same historical truths about the 10 Commandments and all those things still in them that remain preserved. So in that period of time between 200 BC and 1947 AD is the institution of the Catholic Church. It is the beginning of the veneration of people. It is the establishment of the papacy. All those things happen in that time frame, and those remain untouched in the interim. So yeah, we have good reason for predating that, but I don't know in particular about that, but that's interesting. Grace 1 or Grace 2?
Can you elaborate a bit more on the argument that many other religions have a Jesus figure and a similar story?
My favorite thing to do with that idea is really unpopular, but it's just to say, like what? Like who? Bill Maher gets up and he loves this argument, right? He made a whole movie about it. And so he talks about, well, I forgot what he says. It's Isis or Osiris. Osiris also has 12 disciples. And Osiris also died. And Osiris also came back from the dead. And Osiris also did all these things. It's just a recapitulation of the same story. Until you ask an Egyptologist, is that the story of Osiris? And they tell you, no. He did not have 12 disciples. He was not... If by virgin birth you mean that his mom ate him and scattered his remains around, then maybe, you know what I mean? So when you actually look at the stories of him and you don't just take someone's word for it and the recapitulation, the regurgitation of misinformation, it doesn't stand up in scholarship. It's just this popular thing that's been reiterated over and over and over again. The idea of like the Sumerian epics or the Enuma Elish, right? And Well, it's the same formation, except when you actually read it, like where do the mountains come from? Well, God says he brought ex nihilo, everything was created. God made the mountains and the seas and everything. Well, how were they made in the Enuma Elish, in the Sumerian epics? Well, a woman named Tiamat got in a fight with her husband, she died, and her breasts became mountains. So you're like, yeah, those are they're the same. What? But how? So 100% of the time when you ask someone, demonstrate for me through a lens of Egyptology or Sumerian epics where you're talking about these stories being the same, would be a question. Some people go, well, you've got flood narratives in a whole bunch of different cultures, to which I respond, so there was no flood? I don't understand. Like, what's the end of the line of argumentation? Like every culture talks about there being a global flood. So there was no global flood? I don't understand. That would seem contrary to what you wanted to say there. You've got list of different kings in Samaria about the kings before the flood and the kings after the flood and all these other things. So you've got a lot of reasons why you're talking about a similarity in stories when you say, well, in this case, the gods were angry, and the Bible says that God gets angry. So you see that, for me, that's wholly uncompelling. And the notion of God becoming man and not needing mankind, but dying on behalf of mankind, the suffering servant mentality, it was such an affront to every civilization that it stands alone in all of human history. I think Tom Holland makes a really good point in this when he writes his book Dominion, which is a great historical narrative on the newness of Christianity that had never been seen before. And a lot of his critics say the same thing, and then Tom Holland's response is always, like what? And they're just kind of gobsmacked, because there's really any comparison is kind of like saying the Super Bowl last year is going to be a lot like the Super Bowl this year. They're both going to have football, and someone will win, and there will be 4 quarters, and you're like, well, that's just to say they're playing a football game. That doesn't mean anything more significant than that. So anything I've seen as a side-by-side comparison has been extremely uncompelling. It might be compelling to some people, but when you actually look at it and don't just take people's word for it, and you dive in and say, show me what you're talking about, most people stop right there and go, yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know what I'm talking about. I just heard someone say it. Which, is that kind of the similar situation you're talking about, Grace? You've heard it said? Yeah. So that's kind of the same story all the time. That's a good question, though. It's a very popular question, so I appreciate you asking it, because it gives credence to that.
Someone asked a question, they didn't share their name, but kind of related to that. What is there to say about the idea that Genesis and books were written to appropriate and appeal to other cultures? So they're kind of saying like other flood stories coming before Genesis was written. Is there anything to that?
Yeah, but that still wouldn't prove anything, because the argument would have to be that Moses or the writer of the Tanakh or the Pentateuch had knowledge of this, stole the idea of it, and then inserted it into a biblical flood story, which everything else in the scripture is so flooded with archaeological evidence and all the truisms of such, that really all you're saying is both of them talk about a flood. And the fact that someone wrote about the flood before Moses could have possibly written about the flood doesn't mean there was no flood. It could just mean that someone else, when Moses writes it and he's given that divine inspiration, that someone else has beat him to the punch and written about the same exact event that took place, or whatever it might be. So I don't think it does anything to prove the point that what Moses wrote is bunk or false. I would still be interested in the historicity of that document and the textual criticism related to that document. I'm just saying, what if I conceded everything and you found a document that predates it that tells the exact same story? For me, that doesn't do anything except for retell the same thing, unless the story that was there said, and by the way, there's no guy named Moses, and so then they're in conflict with one another. But different people telling the same story of a global flood, for me, would be nothing but a preponderance of evidence, not an absence of such. So that's in implying the concession of the idea that there's something that predates the Mosaic text, which I would still argue is not the case. And we also don't think that Genesis is the first book that was written. Moses isn't writing in real time the story of the flood narrative, right? The book of Job is probably the first book written in the Old Testament. And then God, in bringing his people out of Egypt into Sinai, begins to give Moses the books of the law, where he tells him the story and fills in those spaces. So none of that would go against the biblical narrative, even if it was the case. So it's interesting. I don't have any confirmation on it, but even if I did and conceded everything, it wouldn't change the veracity of the Old Testament.
Okay, Grace. Other Grace. You can go ahead now.
How or when and where does temptation and evil enter the world if the world is created perfect and sinless because God is so holy that he cannot coexist with evil? How did it enter his perfect creation?
Oh man, it feels like such a great segue to this weekend. So this weekend we're asking the question: if God exists, how could evil exist? If there is a good God, it's affectionately known in philosophy as the trilemma. These three truisms: that God is all powerful, God is all loving, and yet evil exists. A dilemma is a problem between two things, right? I got to pick up the kids at 3:00, but my doctor's appointment's at 3:00. How can I be in two places at once? I'm in a dilemma. A trilemma is a three-lemma. I have three of the lemma. The first lemma being God is all powerful, so he'd be able to stop evil. The second one is God is all loving, so he would want to stop evil. And the third part of the trilemma is but evil exists. So how do you rectify those things? We're going to jump into that kind of headlong this weekend in that conversation. When did evil enter the world? What do we mean when we say evil and suffering? Historically speaking, through the scriptures, we would understand that the way that God made mankind is he made them with free will. And free will, if it doesn't have the opportunity to rebel, it isn't truly free in the first place. So we see Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden rebelling against God's perfect command, being tempted by the serpent to go their own way. And that's when sin and evil entered the world. That's when the human genome fell. That's when all of creation fell along with it. So the short answer is we find that in Genesis chapter 3. Right after that, Genesis 3:15 is where the proclamation is that Jesus is going to come and fix the brokenness of the world. But that would be the timeline of it. But the reason behind it, we'll talk about a lot this weekend. That's what the whole sermon's about this weekend. I think it's a great question.
All right, next question is from Aiden. Aiden, where are you at? Right up here.
So one of the most common questions I receive and wonder myself is, how do I know what parts of the Bible's instructions should be taken literally and followed exactly? And what parts should be taken with a grain of salt or adjusted, given that our modern legal system and what social norms are nowadays are much farther deviated from our Christian lifestyle more than they were back then. For example, we obviously can't stone somebody for sinning, or being, committing adultery. So how do you go about distinguishing in that gray area?
Aiden?
Yeah.
That's a good question. So the question you're asking is hermeneutical, or it's systematic theology, and it's really understanding the difference between prescription and description in Scripture. It's the same argument that people make when they look at the Old Testament and they see that Solomon had 700 wives and things like that, and then they intuitively go, okay, so the Bible commends polygamy, to which the response is, why do you think the Bible put the idea that Solomon had 700 wives in it? Well, look what happened to Solomon. The guy's life was a disaster. It seems to insinuate that it's not the best idea to do stuff like that. And so really the whole Old Testament is full of a whole bunch of descriptions of people who broke it because we need a better Savior. Why is David, who is this perfect exemplarization of a king, right? He's the king of Israel. He's a man after God's own heart, and yet he's murdering and he's committing adultery, and he's kind of broken everything that God had in store for the king, which is a man after God's own heart. So who is Jesus? Jesus is the better David. Moses is supposed to be this great prophet, but then Moses gets angry and he takes it out on the rock and he frees the people from temporary slavery in Egypt. But here comes a better Moses named Jesus who's going to save his people forever from the bondage of slavery of sin. So the whole Old Testament's really just setting up our deep need for a Savior. So when you're asking the question, what's prescriptive and descriptive, particularly when it comes to the New Testament, right? You're talking about, well, or the test of an Old Testament prophet that you'll find. The Old Testament says, if someone makes a prophecy about the future and they're wrong, you should kill them, right? But you can go to any modern day prophecy service at some, more charismatic churches, and people will get up and go, I've gotten a word from the Lord. And you want to be like, someone write this down. You know what I mean? Because if you miss, the test of a prophet is that you foretell future events. And if you miss this, we're supposed to kill you. We don't do that. In the transition between the Old Testament and the New Testament, we find the upholding of moral law, but we find the disintegration of what we would call ceremonial law. Because Jesus fulfills all of those things, they're no longer required and necessary for those things. Even in the Old Testament, there's a great book by Dr. Paul Copan. He writes a book called Is God a Moral Monster? It's really interesting. But in it, he talks about a lot of these things. Like, I talked about this before, where we found the stele that talks about David and the line of David, and that they utterly destroyed all the Israelites, and yet they're still walking around. The Old Testament has things like this before. And God told them to utterly destroy the Canaanites, man, woman, and child. And then the next chapter is God telling the people how to get along with the people that are still alive from the Canaanite people. Like, the Canaanite people continue to exist. So why do we have, in one verse, you utterly destroyed all of them, and the next verse, here's how you cohabitate with them in a way that doesn't let them infiltrate your culture? Because God is speaking the language of the people of that time, and what he's doing is he's kind of creating this moral arc of speaking to their people at that point. Like, what was he talking about with slaves? Do you think that God's idea of a perfect society would include indentured servants and prisoners of war? For sure not. Absolutely not, right? That wouldn't be the case. He's speaking to a group of people who are now getting bombarded by the Amalekites and the Jebusites and the Hittites and the Budlites and the Millerites are all coming in and trying to take. So God says, here's how we're going to interact with this period of history, but it's all pointing towards when the perfect moral Savior would come. So the difference between prescription and description is the work of the theologian to decide on any verse. You can't just go, well, anything in the New Testament is prescribed, anything in the Old Testament is described. That's not the case. You have to go into each in particular, and you have to ask the question, who wrote this? Who's this written to? Is there a promise that I can cling to? Is there a truth that I need to hold on to? That really is the role of theologians, and that is why we teach classes like hermeneutics and systematic theology and understanding all of those books. So without going too in-depth into any individual verse that you're talking about, which we could do, but we wouldn't want to do that in front of everyone because we have to really dive into the context. But that's more of a 30,000-foot view of recognizing we want to know what's the genre of literature. There's apocalyptic literature, there's prose, there's poetry, right? When you read Song of Solomon, you're not going to think of that, well, I'm not going to get into a lot of that stuff. But it could both be description and prescription, I suppose. It's getting weird if you know what I'm talking about. But when you say that someone makes you feel a certain way, or the Old Testament when it says God stretches out his hand against Egypt, but God doesn't have hands, right? He's a disembodied mind. He doesn't have form, or we are raised up on the wings of God. God doesn't have wings. So he's speaking language, and it is the theologian's job to recognize the difference between those things. But we get a lot of hints within the text of what we can expect with that. But that's a whole different field outside of apologetics, which jumps into what we call hermeneutics. So it's a good question, and there's a lot of great courses out there to figure that stuff out.
There's so many good questions. We only have time for about 2 more. And so, Gabe, where are you at? We're going to have Gabe close this one out with his question. But first, Michelle asked a question earlier. I just wanted to ask you real quick. If we're interested in studying this in more detail with historical and archaeological support or references, is there a good one-stop shop reference or book short of taking a seminary class?
There's a book written by Sean and Josh McDowell. Sean McDowell is the head of Biola's master's in apologetics degree. He's a good buddy, and he's really, really, really smart. Josh McDowell is one of the pioneers of apologetics in terms of kind of modern day, both epistemological and ontological apologetics. They write a book called New Evidence That Demands a Verdict. I call it the Bible of the Bible. So it's a robust, exhaustive, laborious resource. There's another book by Norman Geisler called The Big Book of Bible Difficulties. But when it comes to like archaeology and stuff, there's a Dr. Thomas Sayer. There's a lot of good volumes written on all this stuff. But I would say New Evidence That Demands a Verdict is a great 30,000-foot overview, comprehensive, robust, systematic approach to biblical canonicity and historicity. The other one that I teach when I do like at my church history class is a book by a guy named Shelley called Church History in Plain Language, and that helps with the canonicity argument. I just read a book last week by a guy named Dr. James White called Scripture Alone, and he's got a lot of great stuff on canonicity and why we reject the Apocrypha and things like that. So that was a lot, but there you go.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could give some advice on how to bridge the gap between being convinced by the evidence, everything you've been presenting in this series, and fully believing and trusting in Jesus and living out your faith?
Dang, man, that's a good question. The interesting thing about your question is when you read the New Testament, what you're going to find is this was Jesus' frustration, which I think enables us to have a frustration even ourselves. Like, this is what Jesus said. He finishes his triumphal entry into Jerusalem when all the people are shouting Hosanna, which basically is a call for the domineering king of the Old Testament, Messiah, to come and conquer the Romans, give us back our temple, fix everything that's been broken. And as they're chanting, save us now, he recognizes, because as John chapter 3 tells us, he has the Spirit without limits, he recognizes that these people aren't saying, come save me from my sin, but come save us from Rome, come save us from these problems we have. And then he turns around and looks over the city, and I love just the attitude that Jesus has, and he says, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how I long to have gathered you under my wings, like a mother hen gathers her chicks. But you instead insist on stoning prophets, killing messiahs, rejecting truth, and you don't do anything with all these things that are laid out so perfectly in front of you. If you can think and recognize that the truth that people aren't just convinced by arguments. They're not just convinced by, this is one thing that's frustrating to recognize about ourselves, and myself in particular. I liken myself a emotionless person when it comes to making decisions. I like to think that I'm just, give me the facts and that's how I make decisions, but you and I both know that's not the case. We know that because when you look at the people surrounding Jesus, like Judas or Nicodemus or the Jewish ruling council or the people after he died, they all watched these things firsthand. And yet, even within his own group, people were disbelieving. People were following Jesus around. In John chapter 6, it says, many people deserted him because he gave them hard teaching. That's, I think, the perfect example. Mark chapter 10, Jesus meets the rich young ruler. The rich young ruler has some level of laud and honor to Jesus. It says he falls down before him and he says, good teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life? To which Jesus says, keep the law perfectly. To which the rich young ruler says, I've already done that. To which Jesus says, it says in the text, Jesus looked at the man and loved him and said, one thing you lack. Go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and you're going to store up for yourself treasure in heaven. And it says the man walked away sad because he had great wealth. There is a multitude of reasons why evidence alone won't convince someone. I like how the great philosopher once put it, you can't convince someone against their will. This is what Aldous Huxley said when he said, or Thomas Nagel, he said, you don't understand. Jordan Peterson's another great example. Jordan Peterson just very recently said, I recognize that if I accept that Jesus is the Savior of the world and that he is the God of the universe in human form, I can't accept that a little bit. My whole life would have to change. My whole system would have to change. My whole calendar would have to change. My whole importance level would have to change. The way that I speak and think and talk and the way that I approach people would all have to change. And he gives such power to surrendering himself to Jesus that he says, I'm not ready to do that, even if I'm convinced that might be the truth. So the answer to your question is evidence alone has never convinced anyone. It takes evidence plus the massaging that Ezekiel talks about, Ezekiel chapter 36, that the Lord is coming in and he's turning hearts of stone to hearts of flesh. And we just have to, as people who are witnessing these things or understanding these things, recognize that oftentimes the reason that we don't believe has far more to do with what we know we need to give up, or the sin that we're living in, or that it means that I'm going to have to stop doing things that feel really good or change the way that I'm living. And for some people, that's just a price too high to pay. They're not really unconvinced by the evidence. And that's why you find people like Bart Ehrman and Bruce Metzger. Bart will say, Metzger is the best textual critic of all time who believes in all these things and he's a Christian. He's my mentor and I don't believe these things. How do you find the people with the exact same information? If we were just mental creatures, we would all believe the same thing once the evidence was presented, and yet we don't. To give something out, this is what Jesus talks about in Luke chapter 12. Count the cost of following me. It's not as simple as I believe these things. If anyone wants to follow me, must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. I believe that even as someone who follows Jesus, I oftentimes don't give the credence to the weight of claiming the name of Jesus that I probably should. and for someone to recognize the gravitas of that and what it means giving up, I think there's way more of a social aspect there. There's way more of a relational aspect. There's way more of an emotional aspect and way more of a just carnal nature than we want to give it credit for. I'm not saying that's for everyone, but I am saying I think that's how you can have two people present with the exact same evidence, one that surrenders fully to Jesus and one says, I'm totally uncompelled. Because we're not just rational creatures. We're all those things. I think it's a good way to summarize it, and I think a good way to finish off the night. So thanks for that question.
Thank you.
I think that's a wrap. Yeah,
that's right.
Thanks so much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Chris.
For sure. Yes.
We'll see you this Sunday. Again, like you mentioned, kind of tackling that question, if God is good, why is there evil in the world? We have 3 services in the morning. We hope to see you here. Have a great night.